There we go. Welcome back, everybody. And we want to welcome back Gary Angel for, I don't know, third or fourth or fifth time on the TLC. He's going to be talking to us today about in-store analytics and testing as opposed to what we're more familiar with, which is in the digital space. So I don't know that he needs an introduction, but he is the CEO and founder currently of Digital Mortar. And then I just kind of went through and started listing everything I could think of. So CEO, CTO, co-founder of Symphonic, which was acquired by EY. He created, I think, the first of its kind conference that was all conversation format, The Exchange. He's the author of Measuring the Digital World and the Measurement Minute, which if you haven't caught up on, you should, because it's fascinating stuff. And it's really easy for those of us with maybe less focus abilities to consume because it's brief, maybe slightly more than a minute sometimes, but it's really awesome. Most of us know him from the things that he's brought to the digital analytics industry, like functionalism and then two-tiered segmentation. But what he's done most recently and why he's here today is because he took all of those innovations in the digital world and translated them into the physical world, which is really quite amazing. In his new company, Digital Mortar, I don't know, can we say it's new? 3-4 years old now?
Yeah, not that new, yeah.
Right, not that new, but still like really, really innovating and more relevant today even than it was when you got it started, thanks to the increasing demand that there is in the world of really understanding the capacity and the physical number of people in the space with COVID and stuff like that. So I expect there'll be questions on that type of stuff when we get in here. But for now, thank you again for being here. And let me pass the... How do I get here? I'm going to stop share. There you go. And you may start sharing, sir.
All right, let's see here. Okay, that coming through?
Yes, sir. Can everybody see?
Well, thanks, Kelly. And yeah, I think I want to just reiterate sort of what Kelly said. I made a change from digital into store analytics a few years back because I thought that this was a new frontier where I could take what I had learned about behavioral analytics in the digital world and apply it to a whole new space. And like most things, some of that turned out to be true and a lot of it turned out to be false. It took us a long time, I think, to get to the point where we were doing any kind of reasonable analytics practice in the store world. And a lot of that has to do with different technologies and coming to understand the technologies and how they work. But it does feel like, especially pre-COVID, we were starting to do a fair amount of interesting real analytics about the way people behaved in store. And my goal today was actually to run through a case study from one of those things and to give you a chance to see a little bit about what this looks like and to think a little bit about how store analytics and particularly testing, because this was very much a test and learn exercise. A lot of it is more analytically oriented. I've never been a testing expert. It's not really my field, but obviously there's a tremendous amount of overlap between analytics and experimentation. And this was a great example of a customer who was very interested in the experimentation side, more interested in the experimentation side than the analytics side. And they really they did an installation of analytics over a particular feature area, and they really did a bunch of iterated testing on it, which was really exciting and fun. And I know you guys have been through that process when a customer or your company first starts to do this, and you start to see the results of experimentation. It's really exciting. It's actual change, and I think all of us want to see what we're doing actually result in change. So that's my brief introduction, and I'm going to run you through this, and do feel free to ask questions as we go through, and I will try to keep the chat up on my other monitor here. Hold on. I'm not seeing the chat screen. Ping me. Kelly, just feel free to sing out if you see questions.
I got you
covered. So I think with this, with store analytics, it's a bit of background about how this works. We started out doing log analysis many years ago, but the way everybody does it now is with little JavaScript tags put onto pages, so that whenever someone loads a page, a message fires off to a server and that records it. Well, there's nothing comparable to that in store analytics. In store analytics, there are two major capture technologies that we use. One is electronics, looking for the signals that people's phones push out to the world and then using those signals to figure out where they are in space. And then the other technology is camera. And camera is pretty straightforward. It's exactly what you think. It's a video camera sitting up in the ceiling. Most stores have this. Almost every walk into has it at the door for something called door counting or people counting, which is just counting how many people come into the store. But that's usually all they have. Most of the other cameras that you'll see in the ceilings of stores are for loss prevention. They have absolutely no analytic purpose. They don't record anything except video signal. They're only used by humans to go back and look for things, or by security officers who are watching for people shoplifting. So when you look up at a store, you will see plenty of cameras in the ceiling, but you won't actually see much measurement going on. This exercise, the test that I'm going to talk about today, was done with camera. And camera has some real advantages with electronics, particularly for this kind of detailed testing. What we found with electronics is, A, it's not super positionally accurate, but B, we can't really see what people are doing. I mean, when a phone pings out, even if by some magic we can geolocate it to exactly where they are in the store, we have no idea what that person was looking at, which direction they were facing, whether they were touching product, whether they were carrying product. All of those things are totally invisible to electronics. With camera, all those things are visible. So camera is the primary tracking technology that we use when we really want to do detailed analytics. So that camera, what does the camera collect? Well, the camera collects video, but that video gets translated into data about really a few things. A shopper identification, which is just an ID. It's random. There's no facial recognition going on here. The camera doesn't recognize. As soon as someone steps out of the frame of the camera and steps back in, they're a new person. I mean, literally, if they step out of the camera frame and step back in, they're a new person. That's one of the things to think about with this kind of testing. Now, you can matrix multiple cameras together to make a larger view area. But no matter how large you make that view area, as soon as someone steps out, if they step back in, they're a new person. So it's really just a random ID, but the camera's tracking exactly where they are. It's telling you how they move. It's giving you a path through space. And in this case, we tuned the camera to pick up product interactions. So we did a bunch of ML to look at the video signal and figure out whether people were touching product and whether people were carrying product. So those are extensions to what typically we do by default, but it's the kind of thing that you can do with a really rich video signal these days. So that gives you a data stream that's like XY coordinates, person objects, and events. And then that gets translated into a reporting interface that allows you to see how people are actually navigating the space, where they're spending time, and where the hotspots are. So that's the basics of how all this works. And that's really the stuff that we're going to use. But I thought it might be interesting to show you a little bit of video. This is actual video capture from the area. This is a later iteration of the area after a fair amount of testing and change. But this is the image that's getting captured. And you can see I highlighted some things that come along here. You can see people walk into the area. You can see them traverse. Sometimes you can see them pass through. You can see people circle around displays. That tells you that they're getting engaged with them. You can see people as they pick up product or touch product. Those are all the things that are getting tracked. And it's at that level of detail that this analysis is happening. It's pretty cool, really. I mean, if you think about it, this is a kind of view where we have web tools that are somewhat similar to that, the click-tail type tools that actually track the way the mouse moves across the screen and things like that. This is very comparable. It's the same level of detail, and we're using this to do the same kind of analysis, really detailed analysis about what people were doing inside the space. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next thing. So that video image ultimately gets translated into like maybe 4 basic metrics that we think about. And the first one really is opportunity. So when we think about a feature area like this, one of the big questions that clients have is just how many people come into the area? This seems super basic. In digital analytics, it's been a long time since we had to worry a lot about people saying how many people are coming to my website. So do we know that generally? I mean, it's still a metric that people look at, but it's something we all kind of have a great sense for. But what was interesting in this case, this is a feature area, usually positioned near the front of the store. And they've been doing this for years. They had this feature area for years, but nobody in the whole organization had the faintest idea how many people actually stopped and looked. 0. They had no idea. They had no idea if this was effective. They didn't know if it was engaging. They had totally anecdotal evidence. Some store manager says, no, nobody stops and looks at that stuff. And others say, it gets a fair amount of traction. And that's where it stood. That's where it stood for years and years and years of effort of people planning this space, putting merchandise out and letting it go and nobody have any friggin' idea whether people even were moving through the space or not. So that's opportunity. The second part of this is engagement. Okay, if you get people moving through, does anybody stop? And for engagement, we usually use a time metric. Do they spend time? Because if people are walking through, they spend literally no time. You can walk through this feature in about 3 seconds. And if you're not engaged, that's how long it's going to take you. And we see plenty of people move through this area in like 2 or 3 seconds on the camera. The good thing is the camera is like 30 FPS, right? So we're getting like 60 frames of a person who moves through in 2 seconds. We know exactly what they did. But if someone stops and spends like 10 or 15 seconds, that's engagement. So typically, and this is a little different than digital, the thresholds of engagement are super low. So instead of saying like 5 minutes for engagement or 2 minutes for engagement in this kind of merchandise is like 10 seconds. Literally, if someone spent 10 seconds here, it means the display at least caught their eye and it stopped and did something. And then the next level up, and this was really sort of the fancier stuff that I think we actually had to do some work, was interactions. And this is where we had to do the ML to figure out, is someone bending over? Are they touching product? Are they taking product? And are they carrying product? And those were the types of interactions that we really looked at. And then there's flow, just this idea of, how do people move through the space? And do they go from one table to another? If they start at one table, do they go to other tables? How do they flow through the space? And because we're tracking people inside the space as continuous people objects, we can measure their flow. We can see how people track through the space, okay? So that's the basic metrics that we do this. This test was really run at 3 stores in 1 DMA, and it was ongoing. It's been suspended because most of the stores have been closed. They're just starting to reopen, and we're starting to get back into this. But it ran for about 7 months, right up to COVID. So it was running right up to when the stores closed. And so they got a fair amount of testing in, including a full holiday season, which was both a great thing and a problem because, boy, the holidays are utterly and completely different than anything else. And as we try to do testing through the holiday season, we had a lot of issues, which I'll talk about as we go through this. So here's what the client was looking for with this. As they were thinking about this, they had some really basic questions when they started out, including, as I mentioned, just, hey, does anybody look at this? Does anybody stop? But they also had questions about, we changed the setup in this area from time to time, but we're just guessing. We have no idea, how placement actually impacts usage or if it does impact usage. If we do more tables or less tables, if we do different kinds of displays, they have 2 or 3 kinds of displays, does it actually make a difference? They wanted to know, like, at busy times versus not busy times, is there more or less engagement? Like, okay, as you go into holidays, is this area more or less important, right? Holidays are super important to this kind of retail. So understanding things like features, if they really work well during holiday season, they may be worth a lot, even if they don't get much traction at other times. Conversely, if in holiday season shopper patterns actually go away from those things and people go directly into the stacks, that makes them much less important. That was a fundamental question they had. And then they had a question about just, if we change the configuration, can we shape? Can we move people from one product to another in a somewhat predetermined manner? And they just didn't know. They had no idea if they could do that or not. So that was the kind of questions they had. That's the introduction to this. So when we started, this was the initial heat maps, and I've taken 2 here. The traffic heat map and a time heat map. Interactions look very similar to these 2 things. It's the same area. You can see this is a 5-table feature area. It was kind of laid out with the tables on the 4 squares and then 1 table in the center. That was the original configuration. And what you're looking at here, I've taken away the legends to make this not like super identifiable or give you metrics, but red means that there was a lot. So the basic scale is red is heavy, all the way down to deep blue, which means there wasn't a lot of activity. And I'm just going to pause here and let you guys look at this as analysts, because this is the traffic flow around these areas. And we thought this was pretty striking. I mean, I think looking at this, it seemed to us there were some fairly obvious actions to take based on this. But I'll give you guys a minute just to study it and take it in, because I'm so used to looking at these kinds of images. It's like totally second nature to me, but it actually does take a little bit of getting used to, I think, as you do this. So I'm just going to pause for a minute. Okay, any questions about the way this looks before
A couple of questions.
Go on?
And so
Yep.
One of the first ones is, what are the legal issues with using recording tracking in websites? The privacy statement.
That's a great question. We actually don't, that little snippet that I showed you of actual recorded traffic, We don't take recordings on an ongoing basis. It comes off the store. What's happening is all the work is actually done on the edge. Nothing comes off the camera except when we're doing the initial training and testing period. So we do bring it in, we do our training, and then we throw it away. I took one little snippet, shows you there. We have some training snippets floating around, but on an ongoing basis, there is no recording of people. The only thing coming off the camera here is a data stream that's a random person ID, an XY coordinate, and that basic event flags. Did they pick something up? When did they pick it up? And was it product interaction, product event happened here? That's it. So there's absolutely no video coming off the camera. There's no PII. There's no collection of information. There's no way to tie this back to any person. There is literally no video stored anywhere. So this meets pretty much every privacy standard there is, and it's exactly similar to what stores do for door counting. When you walk through a door counter, it is taking a video of you, but it's throwing it right away, and it's just throwing the number out and count. So this works and is doable under pretty much every privacy standard, from GDPR to California to Oregon. There's no facial recognition here. There's nothing like that. And there is literally no data saved about any customer in any way, shape, fashion, or form. Going back to what I said earlier, and like some of the issues we've had are questions like from our clients, like, we do the same kind of thing with queues at Cash Wrap. And one of the questions is, well, if a client takes out a credit card, could the credit card number be on the video? I'm like, well, two things about that. A, the video quality is nowhere near good enough for even the NSA to read the credit card number off of that. But two, there's no video coming off the camera, right? So, it does come off the camera for a very short amount of time. We throw it all away, but that's it. There's no data coming out. So privacy is actually pretty well addressed by this.
And Dylan asks, where are the doors or door entrances and exit points on these particular?
That's a fantastic question, because that's actually super important. So this particular store, this area was positioned pretty much front and center to the door. So as you walk through the door, this was in front of you. The way the store worked was women's was on the right-hand side of the store, men's was on the left-hand side of the store. There was some miscellaneous sort of, I'm going to say garbage, crap, whatever, just miscellaneous stuff off to the left. Most people went into the store and angled to the right or left around this. Cash Wrap was off to the right-hand side from this. So, what we saw was most people who come into the store walk directly through this area, but usually they're going someplace else. This is not the destination area, but there's also traffic coming back. And in particular, if you look at this cross pattern here, this is mostly people walking from one side of the store where they've already gotten shoes back to a Cash Wrap. Okay, so one of the interesting things about this is there are flows going on. These heat map views don't show it, but there are pathing views that show this. But you actually get two different kinds of traffic. This stream of traffic is mostly people coming into the store, and this stream of traffic is actually people going to Cash Wrap. Very different kinds of people, and it turned out to have a pretty big difference on what kind of merchandise we wanted to place there. Okay, other questions?
Is the system able to track traffic across cameras, different sections of the stores?
That's another great question. The answer to that is yes and no. The answer is yes, but only if the cameras are all matrix. And what that means is the cameras need to be placed so that there's a little bit of overlap in the field of view. They're not sophisticated. This kind of sucks. We have pushed the vendors we worked with really hard. We would love to be able to put a camera like in footwear and another camera in jeans and be able to just say, this person showed up in jeans and then they showed up in footwear. Doesn't work. The way it works is it tracks people and then it does a geometric exercise. So as I the camera to the other, it knows exactly the position and it does a positional match. And that works really well. It's at 30 FPS, but it does require us to be overlapping. And it means that in general, that only works for relatively small spaces. So for instance, when we're doing this kind of merchandising analytics, we'll put together typically 2, 3, or 4 cameras to create a space, but we can almost never cover a whole store. It's too expensive and there's too many blind spots.
Which I think answers Bitka's question, which is next. So that was Anthony's, but I think these are pretty similar. She says, you may have already covered this, but she says, yeah, you've already covered it. The technology can't really track a user through the store because of that limitation.
That is right. Electronics is actually much better for that, but it doesn't give you the positional accuracy we needed for this kind of testing. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Well, so this is the first test we did, the first test we recommended. You know, when we looked at this, we said, well, crap, that center table gets no traffic. You know, I mean, look at it. It's sitting there in a sea of blue. Nobody goes anywhere near it. right? I mean, this table gets a tremendous amount of traffic. This table gets a lot of traffic. This table does pretty well. This table doesn't do great, but it does pretty well all the way around it. This table doesn't get any traffic. And, you know, the area was plenty. This is not deceptive. There was plenty of space. You saw that sort of area when it was actually more crowded than the video you saw, because that's a later iteration. But with 5 tables, there was plenty of space for people to flow into the middle. They just didn't. And if you look at the...
Gary, you froze.
There we go.
You're back.
There. I had a bit of a hiatus, I think, where I froze. But so the time heat map was even more distinctive. And so our first test really was, we're just going to move that table. We're going to move the table closer to where...
Get back in presentation mode so we can see the...
Sorry, it flipped out. Yeah.
Unless you think that's what caused it.
Nope, I don't think so. At least I hope not. So let's see. But hopefully nothing serious. So we moved the table closer to the traffic, and that had a pretty profound effect. If you look at the statistics here, we increased the number of interactions coming on this table by about 500%. You know, I mean, a dramatic thing. I mean, it was really every metric skyrocketed. The engagement with the table, the time on table, the interaction rate of people actually picking up product, and the product takeaway rates all went up by like anywhere from 300 to 500%. With this really simple change, right? We literally slid a table like, I don't know, 6 feet, 5 feet in space, something like that. And it was a dramatic impact with exactly the same merchandise. So this is wonderful. I think one of the cool things about this kind of testing is, like most kinds of tests, the simple tests are more impactful sometimes than the fancier tests. We certainly found that to be true. But also, whenever you start testing for the first time, it's such a joy because there's such easy tests that have such big wins, and then that all gets harder and harder and harder the longer you do it, right? I mean, to the point where you do it for a while, and like every test is just trying to eke out the tiniest little gain. But the thing is, stores haven't done any of this. They just have done zero testing. They literally don't know anything. This area lived in a certain configuration that turned out to be obviously wrong on the most easy and straightforward analysis of the data. So yeah, this was a really successful test, which was great. You know, I think anybody who's ever run an experimentation program, which isn't me, but I've seen this happen, knows that early wins are great, right? I mean, it really gets people excited. It gets people behind the program. So it's really nice to be able to do that. I did, wanted to point out a few things that I think from this perspective of this test were both probably pretty familiar to you guys and maybe somewhat unfamiliar. One of the familiar kinds of things, and I'll talk about this in a second, is that at one of the stores, we had a really tough time getting sufficient volume to run the test, and I'll explain why that is in a second. The other thing that was challenging is that people always want to make changes, right? I mean, we're running a test, and the store manager decides he wants to put new product on the table because he feels like it needs to be freshened. And hey, I'm sure this never happens in digital.
A digital world, ever.
Yes, never heard of that one, right? I mean, that happened a lot, and we sort of found ourselves, we had to convince people that this methodology meant that you had to keep things static for a little bit, and that was a constant war. Here were some things that maybe you wouldn't have thought about. God knows we didn't think about them when we first started. One of the biggest challenges we had was that almost every day, the tables got moved. This was really hard for
like
us.
for cleaning?
The tables are on freaking rollers. The tables are on rollers because a lot of stores these days are set up to make changes easy. They want to be able to make changes. But in doing on a day-to-day basis, really without even intending it, the associates would just move the tables around. It was so frustrating for us because all of a sudden our data would start showing these weird shifts, like there would be interactions where there wasn't a table. There would be people moving where there was supposed to be a table. And then we'd take a snapshot of it and we'd see that the whole setup had changed just a little bit. Everything just got shifted around. We eventually built out the system where every morning, the system takes a snapshot of the store setup, matches it to the snapshot of the previous day, looks for changes, adjusts automatically if it can, and if it can't, it notifies us. And that helped solve this problem. We had multiple conversations with them, begging them to stop. We actually went out and we taped little pieces of tape on the floor. So line the wheels up with these pieces of tape so they're hidden, right? We tried everything. It was really hard. The system evolved on this, but it was a real challenge. And that's something you just don't have with digital. Another thing that was a challenge was we saw something we called day fade, which is the tables got less and less effective as the day went on. And the reason is people come in and they handle the merchandise. So they're literally picking it up and they're putting it back, or they're taking it away, but they're putting it back in the wrong place, or they're jumbling it. It's not as visually appealing. So the table works less and less well unless associates come back and reset it up. Well, that doesn't happen in digital, right? Your pages aren't friggin' changing because your customers are interacting with the page. That happens in the real world. It was a real problem for us. It was an interesting finding, but it also made things more challenging because what we realized was that as the store got busier, day fade happens quicker and quicker, which kind of messes up your statistics as you go through this. The other thing that's a little bit unfamiliar for people in the digital world is we had to deal with measuring associates because associates are moving through this area all the time. They're restocking tables and things like that. This was a challenge for us. We had to work really hard to try to identify associates. So those are all the things that were, what's that?
You can't block their IP addresses.
You can't block their IP addresses. That's right. And you know, they weren't that distinctive. Some places people wear very distinctive, you know, uniforms or shirts or whatever. There are techniques for doing it, but it's challenging. And it was one of the hardest things that we actually had to deal with in this one. I mentioned the volume was a problem, and I just wanted to show this stat. There were 3 stores involved. 2 of them had plenty of volume and tracked very consistently. The third one didn't. This was totally a factor of layout. In store number 3, this section was positioned more off to the left, not center, for people to walk through. And it got a fraction of the traffic. That was an interesting finding in and of itself. It told us that, hey, if you don't put this feature section right front and square center from the door, you're not going to get traffic. And that was what was happening in the store. That was a learning in and of itself, but it basically meant we only had 2 remotely comparable stores for most of our testing, which was a significant drawback. So I just want to run through some of these other tests to give you a sense of stuff you can do. Here, I had 3 different layouts to see how we could influence traffic flow. So we had that sort of upper left one with the 5 tables. We tried grouping the 3 tables in a phalanx up front to see how that would impact and whether we could get people to sort of flow around it in center. And then we tried what we called a very disruptive layout, which is very crowded with a whole bunch of stuff, including a mixture of table types as we go through this. The original, when we looked at traffic flows, as you saw, you could probably, you knew this from the heat map, right? Most people were going along the right-hand side of this. Only 21% of people flowed through the center, and 26% of people flowed along the left-hand side. When we did this very disruptive layout, what was interesting was we did shift people from right into center. So people did go and flow through that center section a little bit. But we really hurt the left-hand side. We don't know why. This was one of those things that was kind of inexplicable to us, is exactly why this particular thing worked pretty well. But it seems like most of the traffic shapes, as you saw, toward the right-hand side. As that happens, this particular layout shaped it even more to the right-hand side with the phalanx kind of thing. But then some of that flowed back into the center because of the open there. And then this very disruptive element actually was the best balance. So this is the one where right-hand side, center were almost equal, and left-hand side was almost back where it was in the original setup. So interesting, but this shows how significantly flow is impacted. You know, the way people flow through the area turned out to be very shapeable by where we put stuff, which I think was a really important learning for us, because it told us that we could impact the way people were moving through the space. And I think, you know, just talking about what was familiar and unfamiliar, well, I got to tell you, that phalanx one, was unexpected for us, really. We didn't really expect to see the results that we got. I think one of the things that's a little unfamiliar here, it's not like websites don't have geometry, they do, but the geometry is just way more important in the store, and it's way more complex, right? I mean, in a website, you're typically dealing with pretty much a straightforward grid kind of layout. You know, as when we're programmers or doing HTML and CSS, we lay things out in grids, and most web pages ultimately turn out to be a kind of grid flow. It doesn't work that way in the store. There's angles, there's paths. The way people flow through the store and the geometry is just way more complex, and you have more control over it. Another point on that I wanted to make, I thought this was a pretty interesting test. One of the things that we looked at was where interactions were happening. The merchandise was spread on different tables in different ways. And one of the things we noticed was that corners pretty consistently outperformed middles. Here's the here's the ongoing for that. You can see that over time, the interaction rates were consistently higher by corners. So this led us products that had relatively sparse table sets to put all the product on each of the corners, which definitely worked better from a table kind of thing. And then for more crowded product, to put the most important products on the corners. So we were trying to, if we really wanted people to engage with the product, we were giving it differential engagement on the table. And this again was something that, you know, no one had ever really known, you know, as we thought about this. And it turned out that not just the position of the products, but the angles of the tables turned out to be pretty important in shaping how much engagement you got around these things. I think one of the really familiar things about this is, well, no surprise. Hey, if you've done digital merchandising, the location on the page matters a lot, right? I mean, it's like hugely different whether you're the first thing on the page or the seventh thing on the page. Well, that's true in the store too, but the store has a more complex geometry than the website. And so, you know, some of the things like corners and middles, that doesn't really exist so much in web pages, but it sure as heck does exist in the store. This was an interesting one. You know, I think the disruptive merchandising display was something they rolled out around holiday season. And, you know, this is, the left-hand side is sort of like the 5-table configuration as they had tested it previously. This was a much more disruptive configuration. It looks like the right-hand side is better, but there's two things that were going on here, both of which are real challenges in the store. One is because they changed so much all at once, it was really hard to isolate what a particular change did, right? I mean, we looked at this and some tables were performing better, some tables were performing worse. They added whole new kinds of displays we had no benchmark for. In all, when all was said and done, it did look like the right-hand side was performing a little better. Most of the metrics, when we looked at the entire area, improved on the right-hand side. And they improved by a fairly significant amount, but not like completely significant. And one of the other challenges, which really rose up and bit us here, is when they rolled this out, we were just heading into the holiday season. And that made virtually all of our comparisons useless, right? In some cases, because we had at least two stores, we put one store and one setup at another. The holiday is too important for the stores to do that. So when the holiday came up, they rolled both stores with the setup they wanted at the same time, which meant that we didn't have comparables and we had to do all our comparisons on a time basis. That's really common in retail. I mean, setups take more time. They can't bring them up and down in a minute. They can't run a true A/B test where one customer gets one and the other customer gets the other. That's a severe limitation. And what it meant was we had to compare the 2 weeks before with the 2 weeks after, but those 2 weeks made a huge difference in terms of total traffic to the store. And the end result was we couldn't really tell whether this was better or worse. You know, I mean, it's one of those things where I think everybody who's ever done experimentation or analytics knows that when you change a lot all at once, it's really hard to separate out the measurement effects. But it's harder in the store stuff, not because the measurement is per se harder, but because there's other forces driving them to try to change everything at once. And I'll tell you, you cannot go in and argue with that store manager, don't change it on November 17th because we're running a test. He's like, screw you, this is holiday. I've got to change. I can't leave this crap out here. This Christmas season is really important to my store and my performance. So it does get harder in the store world. And that's one of those things you have to deal with. So those are the most of the tests I wanted to show, but I just wanted to talk a little bit. I've talked about most of these, but just to give you a sense of the different tests we ran over the 7-month period, we did a whole bunch of tests on the geometry of the space, all of which were interesting and I think useful. We did a bunch of tests around product placement on the tables. Where should product go? Where does it get the most exposure? What parts of the table are most engaging? We did a lot of tests around the mix of tables and the density of features. This was really interesting, and it turned out as we evolved post-holiday that the mix of flat tables, but some of those rotators as well, really worked better. And that was something we were able to see. So, and higher density generally did seem to work better in the area, but clearly you could go too far with that. We started to mess up the flow. And then I thought one of the more interesting tests we ran, I didn't really talk about this, but we did as we started to look at flow, we started to do more testing about what kind of product we put on particular tables because we realized that we were getting different kinds of customers. I mentioned earlier that those back tables in those back areas are getting customers who are usually, you know, already purchased products. So one of the things, I think if we go back to this, if I go back to this disruptive one, let me see if I can get a picture of that. Okay, so you can see these are more accessory type things. We recommended that they put more accessory type things in that because that's people flowing across toward cash wrap. So that isn't people coming into the store for the first time. That's people who already have a purchase. They've already got, they've already got something and they're flowing through. So we treated it more like the kinds of things you put in your cash wrap, and that worked pretty well. So tuning the product mix relative to the flow, I thought was a really interesting kind of test. And then we tested table angles, moving tables and pivoting them around. And pivoting around not only changed quite a bit the exposure of products on the table, but it also changed the flow quite a bit. So as we pivoted those tables, you notice a lot of times they were pivoted so there was a tendency to flow into the center, which increased the amount of engagement we got in the total area. So a lot of really interesting tests that ran through this. I thought I just wanted to I'm almost done here and we'll take more questions, but just summarizing some of the general thoughts that I came away with reflecting on this experience. First of all, I thought it was really exciting. I mean, we're doing more of this kind of stuff than we did 2 years ago. Most of our clients were doing crap all interesting stuff. I mean, if they were, they were just trying to get their heads. Now I think we're starting to see our clients actually do interesting experimentation with the data. This kind of test and learn stuff is fantastic. I mean, it's just so much more exciting when people getting reports. And I thought that was great. It is harder to run A/B tests, and I think I've touched on some of the things that are really hard. The biggest thing is you can't run a true A/B test, right? You have to find store comparables. No stores are truly comparable. 2 of these stores had almost identical layouts, but as with most merchants, layouts across stores are quite different. You could see how the third layout, a change in the layout, had a devastating effect on the traffic into the section, which essentially made all the testing totally useless. Not only did we have enough traffic, but even if we did have enough traffic, if that was in a different area, you get a fundamentally different kind of customer, and all the tests are going to be different. So comparable testing is hard. A/B testing in itself can't be done purely, and there's a lot of pressure on things like seasonal setups for the stores to all roll at once and all go to something fundamentally different. That's a real challenge from before-after kinds of analytics. Geometry, extremely influential and very controllable. Oh my God, you have so much control over this. I think one of the things that I didn't really recognize coming into this was how much stores have been set up these days to make these kinds of changes. It's not that anybody has the measurement to really drive it, but they do want to make changes. There are merchandising teams that are making changes all the time. And these most displays and racks now are set up in ways that actually make them adjustable in the store. So you can actually do a lot of this kind of testing. On the other hand, this can be a challenge in digital, but it's so much harder in the store. What's called compliance, just getting the stores to do what you want, getting them to do the setups you want, getting them to keep those place and getting them not to tinker with them is a heck of a lot harder. You don't have control over that. We had endless struggles with this, and I would bet that everybody who ever runs a test in store is going to have endless struggles with this. And I'll tell you, it was not. We had a pretty person who was leading the charge in this program. He would literally go out to these stores and talk to the store managers, and we still had a hard time with it. So this was not a senior buy-in kind of problem. It's just friggin' hard kind of problem. Display placement has a massive and controllable impact on effectiveness. This was great. This was gratifying. We're really sure about this, right? I mean, when you run this kind of testing, you don't know if you're really going to get results, but it really did make a big difference. And even relatively small things like adjusting the table corners and faces made substantial differences in productivity. And you do, as a merchant, it was really interesting to be able to prove that we can control the way people flow through these areas. We have a lot of control over that with all the things we do, and that gives us a lot of grounds for testing. So I guess just summarizing, I think the most important lesson I came away with from this is there's a lot of tests. It's not hard. I mean, sometimes one of the hardest things about testing and experimentation is coming up with ideas. But here the ideas were relatively straightforward. It didn't take a genius. It didn't take real brainstorming. It didn't take deep analytics. It didn't take a whole bunch of people, spending months hypothesizing. It was mostly just, hey, here's 5 or 6 obvious factors. Let's change them and see what happens. And that really worked. The last thing I was going to go through is just real quickly what it takes to do this. And this is sort of the 6 steps involved here. The first is getting hardware. The hardware we used here was NVIDIA Jetsons. These are little single board computers with a heck of a lot of processing power on them. It's a very popular choice if you want to do edge-based ML. And we used cameras. We used stereoscopic cameras with 2 lenses. We typically use cameras from a company called Zovis, but there's a lot of choices out there. Installation is one of the harder things. One nice thing is when we're doing One nice thing is when we're doing big installations of full store tracking, it's actually really expensive to do the implementation. It's not unusual for the installation company to make more money than we make, actually, which I gotta say is sometimes frustrating. But putting stuff in stores, and particularly cabling up and ceilings, is expensive. One nice thing about this kind of test is it usually only takes 1 or 2 cameras. So the camera will typically cover about 400 square foot. Putting 1 or 2 of these together generally gives us a pretty good view of a merchandising area. This particular one that I've been showing you was a 2-camera setup. So pretty inexpensive. It took about 2 hours to install, and not super expensive. There is an ML training period, particularly for things like interactions. Most of the basic stuff, like just people identification, where people are in space, that stuff just falls out of the basic camera measurement. But if you want to do interactions, if you want to do product takeaways, you have to do ML training. We spent months actually on this. Sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy. It took us a while to get it decent, I have to say. When we started, I think what we saw was, we did an initial round of training, we rolled it out, the numbers just looked bizarre to us, and we went back and did more training and improved it. All of this stuff comes back to the cloud. No video comes back to the cloud. We use Azure. Some people ask me, well, do you guys ever do AWS? No, we actually use Azure and we use Google Cloud. We don't use AWS for the very good reason that most of our clients absolutely hate Amazon for pretty understandable reasons. So there is no technological reason why we don't use AWS. There is a psychological reason why we don't use AWS. Sure. We have a reporting platform that translates that out, and then where the rubber meets the road, and really this is the hardest part, as you guys all know, is getting people to actually run experiments and stick with it. So that's the process as it goes. And Kelly, that's it. Have any questions piled up?
So many questions. We won't have time. So I may send you an email with the extra questions if we don't. Okay, so let's start with Merritt's question. I know a lot of brick and mortar chains have sizable insights teams, even test stores and markets. Have you encountered or collaborated with many of these? Are they typically more old school? Curious if you found that these teams use distinct methods to yours, or if there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, that's a fantastic. Yes, we have, and it is true. They're pretty different. I mean, I think most stores, even really sophisticated stores with analytic teams, have virtually no behavioral data about what happens inside the store. Most of the analytics they do is merchandising analytics. And it's based on what people buy. It's market basket analysis. In some cases, it's campaign analysis, right? I mean, they do a lot of, not unlike digital, there's a lot of campaign analytics that goes on. So we did a campaign in store, how did it impact the store, what kinds of stuff did it do? This data is new for them. And in many respects, they are old school. I think one of the things we found that was pretty interesting, we've actually had a pretty hard time with our original product, the full store journey tracking, getting those kinds of teams to really embrace it. But they really did it. They really do embrace this product. It seems easier. The visual merchandising teams are usually there are visual merchandisers. There are people who plan out exactly these setups. They're super excited to get their hands on the data, and it's a really easy sell for them. So yeah, those teams exist. We have worked with them, sometimes with good success, sometimes not. This particular focused on merchandising, we've actually had better luck with that. The merchandising analytics teams and the merchandising teams in general are really very receptive to this. It's something I think they probably always wanted, but never even knew was really possible. So that's been actually good and somewhat a better experience than with our full product.
Neha asks, are there any attributes captured that could be used for customer segmentation?
Oh, yeah. In our full journey product, we do some behavioral segmentation based upon like where people spend time, what sections they visit, what path they take. In this kind of merchandising analytics, the answer to that is almost going to be no. It does depend a little bit. So for instance, some of the cameras we use do gender classification, okay? Some do height classification. Height class, neither is perfect, by the way. Yeah. I mean, these are top-down cameras. They don't have the world's best view of people. Stereoscopic does let them get height. The height it will change though. If you actually follow the height of someone, if you walk to the video signal and you watch the height, it's changing like 2, 3, or 4 inches as they walk across the screen. It's not perfect. It's usually good enough to distinguish adults from children, which is about all that it can be used for. The gender classification typically it'll classify about 80 to 90% of the people coming in. And usually it seems to be right, but then you've got that, 10 to 20% that show up as unknown. That's the most you get. The segmentation is super limited. For retailers, the gender classification is pretty useful, particularly in an apparel area, in a feature area like this, which does often mix. With things like shoes, men and women fundamentally different, right? I mean, the products you're looking at and the products you care about are really different. So doing gender classification is useful. That's as much as you get. We don't have anything else that does anything beyond.
Okay. Dylan asks, what's the main KPIs? Well, the main KPIs that you showed were engagement and traffic. Do you do any correlation with revenue per visitor, that kind of thing?
Yeah, the closest we get with that with this product, and again, it's different with the full journey. With this product, the one that came closest to rubber meets the road is product takeaways. So we were actually able, we tracked product interactions. Did you touch product? But then we had a product takeaway metric. The product takeaway metric, if they take product,
we hope they're paying for it and not just taking it.
Right, and we don't know about returns, things like that. But and there's no track to the cash wrap, right? So if they took that product out of the area but threw it on the floor, it's pretty unlikely. We felt like that was pretty far downstream. What I will say was interesting is that in most of the tests we ran, engagement turned out to be a pretty good product proxy for interactions and a pretty good proxy for takeaways. A better proxy for interactions than takeaways. The hardest one we had was between interactions and takeaways. Product takeaways, definitely, it still correlated pretty well, but not as well. The product interaction and time correlated really well. So a lot of the analysis we did focused on the simpler metrics because we got more volume on them, so it was easier to run tests. But in this case, I felt like taking it down to product interactions got us pretty close, but not perfect to the actual revenue.
Enrique asks, is there a concern about sample size? Should you be doing this against the same setup in multiple stores? Also, geography, demographics, seasonality, all of those things.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we had a hard time. And like I said, we had to abandon one store completely because the sample sizes were too small. Tests for longer than we would have liked. Running tests for a long time is also more problematic because you're rolling through the season. And the longer you roll through the season, the more it changes. So you start seeing shifts from that perspective. Plus, you start getting that pressure from managers to change stuff. So we would have liked to have had an installation in more stores. It is hard. Picking comparable stores and picking comparable markets is half of what you have to worry about if you're going to do this kind of experimentation. Again, it's different than digital, where even if you wanted to do local testing, you can pick your markets and you can turn them on and off like instantaneously. It doesn't work that way here. You got to do that installation. You got to put the hardware in. What that means is if you're going to build an experimentation program in a store, probably the first place to put effort is figuring out the comparable stores, because we would have loved to have, and we have other clients where we have clients with as many as 60, 70, or 80 stores. A lot of our clients have 20 or 30 stores. In this case, it was pretty limited. We would have loved to have 10 or 12 stores to test with that we thought were pretty comparable. I think that would have made the testing significantly better in a lot of cases. It wasn't impossible. I think we got good results, but that's definitely true. There is a lot of work, though, that goes into that, figuring out what a comparable store is. It's a really non-trivial problem.
Scalability. It looked like the learnings that you were, and the insights that you were illustrating that you got out of this were more broadly scalable than what we typically see in a more advanced digital experimentation program. Did you see your customers being able to use these insights more broadly to impact their stores?
Yeah, one of the great things about this particular one was the team that was most engaged was the merchandising team that does the setups for all the stores. I mean, now, again, they have to be careful with that. And they were they understood this. I mean, they have stores with fundamentally different layouts. And boy, maybe some of the learnings, maybe you could take like those corner learnings or some of the shaping learnings and different kinds of layouts. But some of the learnings just aren't going to work when the store is fundamentally set up differently. What we did see was, because the team working on this was the team that controls the setups in a whole bunch of stores, they had a pretty good sense of which stores were similar. It actually made it very easy for them to scale it out. And they did that. That was one of the nicer things about that, is that the findings were actually pretty scalable. And the team doing this had a pretty good sense of how to do that. They knew which stores weren't the same. They stayed away from, I think they stayed away pretty well from overgeneralizing the conclusions, which definitely would be a risk in this kind of stuff.
Two more questions about these. One was around point of sales, the revenue generation, the data for when people are checking out. Are you guys doing anything to tag the merchandise that you were featuring in these tables to find out if those merchandise were being purchased at a greater rate?
That would be awesome. The answer to that is no. We have a smattering of clients that actually
Not
do
yet.
RFID tag.
The answer yet.
Yeah. I guess that is. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, the only way to really do that effectively is like RFID tag the product. That's actually fairly expensive. And the thing is, it wouldn't be terribly expensive just to RFID tag the products in the feature setups. But most people don't do that. They either RFID tag everything or they don't RFID tag anything. And so in general, the answer to that is no. I think we would love to do that. There are solutions for doing that. And there are merchants that literally do RFID tag every single product. So where that's done, that's definitely possible. And it would, I think, there are two things about that I think that would be really interesting. With a feature set like this, we want to know, did people actually purchase directly from the feature set? But I think there's also interest in understanding, did people then go back into the main product area and end up buying this area, right? And we did not have tracking into that. Now we do get point of sale from most of our clients, and we can look at overall trends with things like that. But that's a different kind of analysis, and that's something that more of the merchandising teams are a little more capable of doing internally anyway. But from our perspective, we did not have great visibility into that. And it is important. Retailers obviously care. Retailers are tight. It's a very low margin business. They care a lot about point of sale. They really want to understand those things. We'd love to do a better job of that. That breakage, I think, between, even we felt like product takeaways is a pretty clear indication, but even so, we get pushback on it. I get it. I mean, ultimately for them, selling stuff is what matters.
Right. Well, we have 3 minutes left. I hear myself all of a sudden. So if somebody unmuted, please remute. But could you take just a second, stepping outside of this example that you gave us, and could you share with the group who may not have gotten to see some of the things that you've been posting about how people are using Digital Mortar related to COVID specifically and the capacity planning?
Yeah, our business has changed a lot, in some ways good, in some ways bad in COVID. I mean, I think we basically going into last March, going into COVID, we had 4 products. We had our full journey tracking system, which was really designed to track at a high level the way people move through a store. We have a queue management product, which is really designed to help people understand when they have queue problems and also be somewhat proactive about it. We have this merchandising analytics product, which is really what drove this case study today. And then we had a door counting product, which is just how many people come into your friggin' store. It's really low end, it's super cheap, and it's really boring. I mean, analytically, it's like the most boring product in the world because it's basically giving you one number, how many people go in. Like everybody else in our business, when COVID came out, we took that door counting product and we modified it to be an occupancy solution. So we were already counting ins and outs. Nobody ever looks at the outs, but if you take the ins and outs, you can actually figure out how many people are in the store right now. That gives you an occupancy solution. And if you automate that, we built like a couple mobile apps, and the mobile apps allow people to see exactly how many people are in the store. It allows you to set custom thresholds and alert so that you can actually say, hey, I'm at 80%, I need to shut down the door, or something like that, or I'm at 90% on over capacity, I need to shut down. And it makes it so you don't always have to have a person monitoring it. That's been interesting, and it's opened up some markets for us. We're doing a lot of university work, with dining halls and things like that. But it's not like a super analytic product in and of itself. It's still in many respects boring. And I think from our standpoint, we saw a lot of demand go away from the high-end analytic products to the more boring commodity products, which is sort of a trade-off. But it is really interesting what you can do with these occupancy solutions. And the cameras have the ability to do things like mask detection. So you can figure out if people are wearing masks or not. You can do safe distancing. Our queue solution allows you to queue people on that and do digital signage. And we're actually working on some interesting sort of queue management type things where people will be able to virtual queue. So for instance, at a dining hall, if it's full, a student will be able to go in a virtual queue and then get a text message when it's their turn to go into the dining hall. So it's changed a lot of the way our business works. But to be perfectly honest, I mean, I'm more excited to get back to the high-end analytics stuff. I think I would love people to get back to more of this kind of stuff than measuring occupancy and how many people are in and out of the store, because, hey, you got to do it. It's operationally important. The other thing, Kelly, now this is more interesting. We have seen a shift where, because a lot of our clients are having to change a lot of their processes with things like ship from store and curbside pickup, what the store is doing has changed. People are using this kind of camera measurement but to actually do people process measurement. So they're actually looking at the way associates are executing tasks. That has been fascinating. Unlike sort of the basic occupancy stuff, which has been good business, but I find it kind of boring. The people process optimization is taking the whole paradigm and saying, you know what, I don't care about shoppers. What I care about is associates and really understanding how they're executing tasks when they're safe distancing, even like in our back office, our associates together too much and things like that. There are really fascinating stuff that you can do with this kind of things. And that's a really cool analytics opportunity. Actually, one I'm a lot more excited about than the basic.
And that's the one you posted about today or yesterday that is my to-read list. Yeah.
Actually, we've been doing some really interesting, we've done a couple of really interesting projects in that people process stuff. And I've actually been spending, I usually spend time on the things that interest me. And that's one that actually does interest me. I've actually been pretty engaged with those projects. So
awesome.
That's been cool.
Well, thank you so much, Gary. Thank you, everybody, for your great questions. There was 2 questions I didn't get to, which I'll send you over email, and then everybody, TLC, I'll send when I send out the email. Gary, with your permission, can I send the PDF of your presentation?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'll send that and the questions that I didn't get to ask and the answers to those as well. Probably early next week. We'll give Gary a little bit of time to answer it. But thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody.